Hello and welcome to the second video in my little two-part series about books written by the author Eric Bergerud about the Second World War in the South Pacific. Last week I published my first book review about the book Touched with Fire, the Land War in the South Pacific, and this week I would like to talk about Fire in the Sky, the Air War in the South Pacific. So when the author did the first book, he already acknowledged that nearly every or all land actions in the South Pacific were ultimately aimed at either capturing an enemy airstrip or providing some space, some land, suitable land to build your own airstrip to then do aerial operations from there on. So after you do, or if you do the land part of things, it makes sense to also write about the air part of things or of operations. And so that's what he did with his second work about the same theater of operations. The book is from 2001. It was published, or at least my version was published by the Westview Press in Oxford, England, I think. Maybe it's Oxford in the United States. I'm so sorry. Should have checked that. It is some 703 pages long, of which 676 are the real topical matter of the book, and some 30 pages are some notes and sources and so on. As you can already see from the very big page count, 703, this is a very big book. And it's very big, very long. I think it's important to state that. The book, much like Touched with Fire, is not a day-to-day simple operational history of what happened in the South Pacific in the Second World War, but rather deals with a number of different aspects which all get their own chapter of what Mr. Bergerud apparently thought was most important to understand this theater of operations. Like talking about the aircraft of both sides, talking about the airmen, talking about the bases or how important bases were, talking about climate, geographical conditions, and how the fighter war was conducted and how the bomber war was conducted and so on. So many different aspects get their own little chapter and not one big one just going through the entire timeline. But of course it does mention what happened in the Second World War in the South Pacific. So you don't need to be a military history wizard already. You can also lean back and get information about that as well. But the context aspect about all the different aspects is more important than simple operational history. I think the main negative aspect about this book is its size. It is very long. And because he's talking about all those different aspects in detail, you sometimes get information twice, or he mentions stuff twice, or maybe more often. And so there's not really a clear storyline there because of this approach to the different chapters and different aspects. Of course, if you talk about fighter combat, then about Rabaul, then you mention stuff that you also mention when you talk about bomber fighting about Rabaul. So that's quite natural. So the big advantage of having all this context and all this information is also the main drawback of this book. On the positive side, though, I think this book is very pleasant to read, just like Touched with Fire. And that is always good, particularly if the book is so long. And it gives a lot of context, lots and lots of context. You get a lot of information about all different aspects of war in the South Pacific, and also how stuff came to be like it was when the two sides arrived there in 1941 or 42. For example, he talks about aircraft development in the 1930s, and that was very interesting for me because I understood some concepts like, for example, the difference between an inline engine and a rotary engine, and what the advantages of both the technologies were for the people back then, or for the designers and the militaries back then. So that's very interesting, a lot of context, very cool. I very like that. Another big strong point for me is that he always, just like in Touched with Fire, interweaves little snippets of interviews he did with veterans. So he talks about something, and then there's a short little paragraph of what one of the combatants had to say about that aspect. And so that really brings all the stuff that he talks about from a theoretical standpoint to life. I think this book is something for somebody who's really interested, and I mean really interested in military history and aspects and context. If you're just interested in operational history, I don't think this is a book for you. And if you don't want to read 700 pages of not quite, but some 700 pages of context, then this is a book for you if you're really interested in the depth and understanding what happened there. So my final verdict about this book, my opinion on this book, is that this is a very good book. And I think those people who are interested should buy it, have a look at it, have a read through, and you won't regret it. Some points may be a bit outdated. Some opinions about the Zero, for example, I don't know if they are still up to spec today, 20 years later. And what's interesting is that there was a plan for a third installment in the series about the naval side of operations in the South Pacific. Oil in the water, I think, but I didn't really find anything about this book. It doesn't look like it was ever published, which is a shame. I think I would have also enjoyed reading that. If you are interested in further reading on the topic Second World War, South Pacific or the Pacific, I already did a review on Kaigun about the Imperial Japanese Navy. A very good book, you can find that in my channel. And Sunburst, also an interesting book about the naval aviation side of the Imperial Japanese Navy. And of course, Touched with Fire, the first book by the author on the South Pacific. I'd like to close on a quote, because I thought there was a little paragraph in the last chapter of the book that quite well summarizes one of the important points of the Second World War in the Pacific. And that is on page 664. Japanese leaders were most aware of the empire's inferiority in terms of industrial output. They did not understand, however, Japanese inferiority in the equally important field of industrial technique. That was a lesson learned only during the heat of total war. On paper, the Japanese could design a fighter that was a match for second-generation US machines, like the P-38 and Corsair. When it came to producing them, however, Japanese industry proved unable to create complex aviation subsystems that possessed fine tolerances for performance and reliability for operational use. With that, thank you for watching, have fun reading, goodbye.